remember exactly where I was sitting when my sister said it. It was at her kitchen table, the one with the chipped blue paint and coffee stains that never come out. The whole family was there for Sunday dinner, passing around her famous lasagna and arguing about who forgot to bring the garlic bread. My son Marcus was helping clear plates, quiet as always, when my sister Linda looked right at me and said with that smug certainty she's perfected over 43 years, "You need to face reality, Carmen. That boy of yours is never going to amount to anything." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The room went silent except for the sound of my mother's fork scraping against her plate. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper, and Marcus, my brilliant, misunderstood, underestimated 17-year-old son, just kept stacking dishes like he hadn't heard a word, but I saw his shoulders tense. I saw the way he gripped that plate a little tighter. And in that moment, something crystallized in my chest. A fierce, protective rage that I'd been swallowing for years. What they didn't know, what none of them could see, was that Marcus had been waiting for something that would arrive in a thin envelope 3 months later. Something that would make every cruel word they'd ever spoken about him taste like ash in their mouths. But before I tell you about that letter, about the moment my son proved them all wrong in the most spectacular way possible, you need to understand what led us there. You need to understand what it's like to watch your child be written off by the very people who should believe in him most. My name is Carmen Rodriguez, and I'm a night shift nurse, a single mother, and a woman who learned that sometimes the people closest to you can be the ones who see you least clearly. This is the story of how my son Marcus, the boy they called a lost cause, a waste of potential, a kid who would never make anything of himself, walked into that same kitchen 3 months later and changed everything with a single piece of paper. This is the story of the day they finally saw what I'd known all along. That sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power, and sometimes the biggest surprises come from the places no one thinks to look. Let me take you back to where this really began. Not at that dinner table, not even when Marcus started his senior year of high school, but 12 years ago in the waiting room of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where I sat holding my 5-year-old son's hand while doctors tried to figure out why he couldn't sit still, why he couldn't focus, why his brilliant mind seemed to work in ways that frustrated every teacher he'd ever had. ADHD, they said. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. They handed me pamphlets and prescription bottles and a label that would follow Marcus through every classroom, every family gathering, every conversation about his future for the next decade. But what they didn't hand me was hope. That I had to find on my own. My family didn't handle the diagnosis well. Linda, always the family spokesperson, shook her head and said it was just an excuse for bad parenting. My mother, Rosa, cried like someone had died. My father, Miguel, didn't say much at all, just started looking at Marcus differently, like he was broken, like he was something to be managed rather than understood. And Marcus, my sweet, sensitive boy, absorbed every sideways glance, every whispered conversation, every lowered expectation like a sponge soaking up poison. The school wasn't much better. Teachers who saw his energy as disruption rather than enthusiasm. Counselors who suggested vocational programs before he'd even hit middle school. Principals who called me at work. So often I started recognizing the number and letting it go to voicemail because I knew it would just be another report of Marcus getting in trouble for something he couldn't control. But here's what they didn't. See what they never bothered to look for. Marcus wasn't just hyperactive. He was curious. He wasn't just distracted. He was creative. When other kids were playing video games, Marcus was building elaborate structures out of whatever he could find. Cardboard boxes, empty containers, broken electronics he'd convinced me to let him take apart. His room looked like a mad scientist's laboratory, full of half-finished inventions and notebooks covered in designs that looked more like engineering blueprints than doodles. He'd spend hours working on projects that had no purpose other than to satisfy his need to understand how things worked. I'd find him in the garage at 10 o'clock at night, taking apart old radios or trying to figure out why the neighbor's sprinkler system turned on at odd hours. He had this way of seeing connections that others missed, of finding solutions that adults couldn't imagine. But none of that mattered to the people who were supposed to recognize his potential. All they saw was a kid who couldn't sit still in class, who forgot to turn in homework, who asked too many questions and challenged too many assumptions. They saw a problem to be solved, not a mind to be nurtured. The worst part wasn't even the teachers or the school administrators. It was watching my own family give up on him. Linda would roll her eyes whenever I mentioned Marcus's latest project or discovery. My parents would change the subject when I tried to talk about his interests. Family gatherings became exercises in damage control, with me constantly apologizing for Marcus's energy, his curiosity, his inability to sit quietly and fade into the background like they wanted him to. By the time Marcus turned 13, he'd learned to expect disappointment. He'd stopped talking about his inventions at family dinners. He'd stopped asking if anyone wanted to see what he was working on. He'd developed this protective shell, this way of shrinking himself to fit into the box they'd built for him, and that broke my heart more than any diagnosis ever could. I remember the night he came home from 8th grade career day. He'd been excited about it for weeks, had prepared a presentation about becoming an engineer. When I asked him how it went, he just shrugged and said, "Mrs. Peterson said I should think about something more realistic, as if his dreams were too big for someone like him, as if his mind, his creativity, his relentless drive to understand and build and create wasn't enough." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not because I believed what they said about him, but because I could see him starting to believe it himself. I could see the light in his eyes dimming, his confidence cracking under the weight of everyone else's limited expectations. Working night shifts at the hospital meant I was often awake during the hours when the world was quiet, when thoughts had space to grow and solidify. During those long shifts, watching over patients who needed someone to believe in their recovery, I made a decision. I wouldn't let my son become another casualty of other people's narrow vision. I wouldn't let them convince him that his differences made him less capable when I knew they made him extraordinary. I started researching schools that understood kids like Marcus. I spent my breaks reading about learning differences, about the connection between ADHD and creativity, about successful people who'd been told they'd never amount to anything and went on to change the world. I learned about Temple Grandin and Richard Branson and Michael Phelps, all people who'd been written off and all people who'd proved the world spectacularly wrong. But more importantly, I started fighting for Marcus in ways I hadn't before. I requested meetings with teachers and insisted they see his potential instead of just his challenges. I found tutors who understood his learning style. I enrolled him in engineering camps and robotics clubs where his energy was an asset, not a liability. I watched him bloom in environments that celebrated his curiosity instead of trying to contain it. The change wasn't immediate. Years of being told you're not good enough don't disappear overnight. But slowly, gradually, I watched Marcus remember who he was beneath all the labels and limitations others had placed on him. He started talking about his projects again. He started dreaming out loud about the future. He started believing in himself. By his junior year of high school, Marcus had found his stride. He was taking advanced placement classes in math and science. He was leading the robotics team. He was tutoring other kids who struggled with concepts that came naturally to him. But even then, even with all the evidence of his capabilities, my family couldn't see it. They were too invested in their narrative of Marcus as the family disappointment. Linda would ask me when I was going to get realistic about Marcus's future. My mother would suggest community college as if it was the best we could hope for. My father would talk about the importance of having a backup plan, as if Marcus's dreams were just fantasies that would inevitably crumble under the weight of reality. But Marcus had stopped listening to them. He was too busy preparing for something bigger, something that would prove once and for all that their limited vision had nothing to do with his unlimited potential. He was getting ready to show them that the boy they'd written off was about to rewrite the story they'd told about him. He was working on college applications, but he hadn't told anyone in the family. He'd asked me to keep it secret, said he wanted to handle it himself, wanted to prove he could do it without anyone's help or interference. I watched him stay up late writing essays, carefully crafting applications that told the story of who he really was, not who everyone else thought he should be. He applied to engineering programs at schools I'd only dreamed of him attending. MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech, schools that saw potential where others saw problems, that understood that the best engineers are often the ones who think differently, who question everything, who can't sit still because their minds are always moving toward the next breakthrough. And then we waited. Through the fall of his senior year, through the holidays, through the long winter months when college acceptance letters would start arriving. Marcus didn't seem nervous. If anything, he seemed more confident than I'd ever seen him. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Like he was holding onto a secret that would change everything. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in March. I was getting ready for work. Marcus was eating breakfast before school, and the mailman knocked on our door with a package that required a signature. Marcus's name was on it, from MIT. His hands were steady as he opened it, steadier than mine would have been. He read it once, twice, then looked up at me with this smile that started small and grew until it lit up his entire face. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I got in. 3 words that meant everything. 3 words that validated every sleepless night I'd spent advocating for him. Every argument I'd had with teachers who couldn't see his potential. Every moment I'd refused to let him settle for less than he deserved. 3 words that proved what I'd known all along, that the boy they'd given up on was just getting started. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, more letters arrived. Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech, full-ride scholarships to some of them, academic honors programs, research opportunities. Each letter was another crack in the foundation of everything my family thought they knew about Marcus. I wanted to call Linda immediately, to march over to my parents' house and spread those acceptance letters across their kitchen table like winning lottery tickets. But Marcus asked me to wait. He had a plan, he said. He wanted to do this his way, in his own time, on his own terms. Sunday dinner at Linda's house had become a monthly obligation, one of those family traditions that nobody really enjoyed, but nobody wanted to be the first to break. That first Sunday after Marcus's acceptances started arriving, I sat at that same chipped blue table, watching my family go through their usual routines, and I felt like I was holding on to the most beautiful secret in the world. Linda complained about her job. My mother worried about her arthritis. My father read his newspaper and made comments about the declining state of the world. And Marcus sat quietly, helping serve dessert, clearing plates, being the helpful, invisible presence they'd grown accustomed to dismissing. I kept waiting for him to say something, to announce his news, to claim the recognition he'd earned. But he didn't. He just smiled that secret smile and went about his business like nothing had changed. Like he wasn't carrying acceptance letters from some of the most prestigious universities in the country in his backpack upstairs. After dinner, when we were all sitting in Linda's living room pretending to watch television, she brought it up again. Marcus's future. Her concern about his prospects. Her certainty that he needed to lower his expectations and find something more suitable for someone with his limitations. "I've been thinking," she said, settling back into her recliner with that tone that meant she was about to dispense wisdom nobody had asked for. Maybe it's time to look into trade schools for Marcus. There's nothing wrong with working with your hands. Not everyone needs to go to college. My mother nodded along, adding her own concerns about the cost of higher education and the importance of being practical. My father folded his newspaper and joined the conversation, talking about the value of honest work and not reaching beyond your grasp. And Marcus just sat there, listening to them plan his future based on their assumptions about his limitations. Listening to them reduce his dreams to their narrow definition of what was possible for someone like him. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just listened with that same patient smile he'd been wearing all evening. That's when I realized what he was doing. He wasn't waiting for the right moment to share his news. He was letting them reveal who they really were, letting them show their true colors before he changed the narrative forever. He was giving them enough rope to hang themselves with their own prejudices and preconceptions. And when they were finished, when they'd said everything they needed to say about his future, when they'd made it clear exactly how little they thought of his potential, Marcus stood up, walked to his backpack, and pulled out a folder. "Actually," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I have something to show you." The weeks that followed Marcus's acceptance were unlike anything I had experienced as his mother. Word spread through our neighborhood faster than I thought possible, carried by Mrs. Patterson's enthusiasm and the proud way Marcus's high school teachers talked about their former student who was heading to MIT. Suddenly, everyone had a Marcus story, a memory of his potential that they claimed they had always recognized. But what struck me most wasn't the sudden shift in how others saw my son. It was watching Marcus navigate this new reality with the same quiet dignity he had shown when people doubted him. Success hadn't changed his character. It had simply revealed what had always been there. He remained humble when classmates sought his advice, patient when younger students asked him about college applications, and gracious when adults who had previously dismissed him now wanted to claim credit for his achievements. The transformation in our family dynamics was more complex. Phone calls that had been sporadic became frequent. Family members who had maintained polite distance suddenly wanted to be involved in Marcus's college preparations. My mother started calling daily with suggestions for care packages she wanted to send to his dorm. Linda began researching Boston neighborhoods as if she was planning to visit regularly. My father, who had rarely asked Marcus about school, now peppered him with questions about his intended major and career plans. It would have been easy to feel bitter about this sudden interest, to point out the irony of their newfound investment in his future. But Marcus handled their attention with the same grace he had shown their neglect. When my mother asked if she could help him shop for dorm room essentials, he accepted with genuine enthusiasm. When Linda offered to drive him to campus for orientation, he thanked her sincerely. When my father suggested they have lunch to discuss Marcus's long-term goals, my son agreed without a trace of resentment. I marveled at his emotional maturity, his ability to separate their past behavior from their current efforts to connect. He could have held grudges. He could have reminded them of every dismissive comment, every lowered expectation, every time they had made him feel small. Instead, he chose to meet their belated support with open arms, as if their change of heart was exactly what he had been, waiting for all along. But Marcus's influence extended far beyond our family circle. 3 weeks after his acceptance announcement, I received a call from his former middle school counselor, Mrs. Chen, the same woman who had once suggested he might be better suited for vocational training than college prep courses. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice carrying an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Marcus's success has made me reconsider how I evaluate students with learning differences. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I realize I may have steered other kids away from opportunities they deserved." She went on to tell me about changes she was implementing in her counseling approach, about how she was now encouraging students to dream bigger rather than smaller. about how she was looking for potential instead of focusing on limitations. Marcus's achievement had become a catalyst for institutional change, proof that their traditional methods of assessment were failing students who didn't fit conventional molds. The impact rippled through his high school as well. His AP physics teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, started a new program for students with learning differences, recognizing that creativity and intelligence often manifested in ways that standardized tests couldn't measure. The robotics team he had led received increased funding and support, with administrators finally understanding that these programs weren't just extracurricular activities, but pathways to extraordinary futures. Most significantly, Marcus himself had become an inspiration to other students who had been told to lower their expectations. A sophomore named Jasmine, who had been struggling with similar challenges, sought him out for advice about college planning. She had been diagnosed with dyslexia and had internalized messages about her limitations, convinced that community college was the highest goal she should set for herself. I watched Marcus spend hours with her, sharing not just study strategies and application tips, but something more important: belief. He talked to her about the power of seeing obstacles as puzzles to solve rather than walls to accept. He showed her his own journey from struggling student to MIT-bound engineer, not to diminish her challenges, but to prove that challenges didn't have to define outcomes. The hardest part, he told her one afternoon when I overheard their conversation, in our kitchen, wasn't learning to manage my ADHD or proving I was smart enough for college. It was learning to ignore the voices that told me I should be satisfied with less. Once I stopped listening to those voices, everything became possible. Jasmine started crying, not from sadness but from relief. She had found someone who understood her struggle, someone who had walked her path and emerged victorious. Within months, she had raised her GPA significantly and was talking about applying to engineering programs herself. Marcus had given her something no counselor or teacher had provided: living proof that students like her could achieve extraordinary things. The transformation wasn't limited to individual students. Marcus's story began appearing in local newspapers, on school district websites, and eventually in educational journals as an example of what was possible when institutions looked beyond traditional markers of success. He was invited to speak at school board meetings about the importance of supporting students with learning differences, to address parent groups about the danger of limiting children's dreams based on their challenges. I accompanied him to his first speaking engagement at the Regional Education Conference, where he addressed a room full of teachers, administrators, and policymakers. My heart raced as I watched my 18-year-old son take the podium, the same boy who had once been too overwhelmed to speak up in class discussions, now commanding the attention of education professionals. "I wasn't supposed to be here," he began, his voice clear and confident. "At least, that's what I was told for most of my academic career. I was the kid with ADHD who couldn't sit still, who asked too many questions, who learned differently than everyone else. I was told to be realistic about my future, to consider alternatives to traditional college, to understand that my brain worked in ways that made certain achievements unlikely." He paused, scanning the audience with the same composure he had shown in Linda's living room months earlier. "But here's what I learned. Different doesn't mean deficient. Challenging doesn't mean impossible. And the students you're most tempted to write off might be the ones who surprise you the most." The response was overwhelming. Teachers approached him afterward with stories of their own students, asking for advice about how to better support kids who didn't fit traditional molds. Administrators requested copies of his presentation to share with their staff. Parents thanked him for giving them hope for their own children who had been struggling in similar ways. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when a veteran teacher, a woman who had been in education for over 30 years, approached us as we were leaving. She was crying openly, making no attempt to hide her emotions. "I need to apologize," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "Not to you specifically, but to all the students like you that I may have failed over the years. I thought I was being helpful by encouraging realistic expectations. I thought I was protecting them from disappointment. But I see now that I may have been stealing their dreams instead. Marcus took her hands in his, this elderly educator and this young man who had just taught her something fundamental about her profession. "You can't change the past," he said gently, "but you can change how you see the students sitting in your classroom tomorrow. That's what matters now." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus patiently answering her questions about learning strategies, about the importance of believing in potential rather than focusing on limitations, about the difference between helping students overcome obstacles and convincing them that obstacles were insurmountable. Driving home that evening, I found myself reflecting on the person Marcus had become. Not just academically successful, but emotionally wise. Not just intelligent, but compassionate. Not just accomplished, but generous with his knowledge and experience. The challenges that others had seen as weaknesses had actually developed in him a depth of empathy and understanding that made him uniquely qualified to help others facing similar struggles. As spring progressed toward summer, Marcus threw himself into a new project. He started a mentoring program at his high school, pairing students with learning differences with successful alumni who had overcome similar challenges. He reached out to graduates who had gone on to excel in various fields, asking them to share their stories and strategies with current students who needed to see that success was possible. The program grew rapidly, with participants reporting increased confidence, improved study habits, and most importantly, bigger dreams. Students who had been planning to skip college altogether were now researching universities. Kids who had been ashamed of their learning differences were learning to see them as unique perspectives that could be assets in the right environments. Marcus's influence extended to me as well, though in ways I hadn't expected. His success had given me permission to dream bigger for myself too. For years, I had been so focused on advocating for him, on proving his worth to others, that I had neglected my own aspirations. I had been content to work night shifts at the hospital, to maintain a stable income that could support his needs, without considering what else might be possible for my own career. But watching Marcus pursue opportunities that others had told him were beyond his reach inspired me to reconsider my own limitations. I started researching nurse practitioner programs, something I had always been interested in but had convinced myself was impractical given our circumstances. If my son could get into MIT despite years of people telling him he wasn't college material, maybe I could pursue advanced education despite being a single mother in my 40s. When I mentioned my interest to Marcus, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Mom, you have to do this," he said, his excitement genuine and infectious. "You've spent so many years fighting for my dreams. It's time to fight for your own." His encouragement meant everything to me, but more than that, his example had shown me that age, circumstances, and other people's expectations didn't have to define what was possible. If he could rewrite the story others had told about his future, so could I. I applied to 3 nurse practitioner programs that summer, using the same determination and optimism that Marcus had shown in his college applications. When my acceptance letters arrived in the fall, just as Marcus was settling into his first semester at MIT, we celebrated together over video call, 2 students pursuing dreams that others had once considered unrealistic. The parallel nature of our journeys wasn't lost on either of us. We had both learned that other people's limited vision didn't have to become our reality, that challenges could be transformed into strengths, that the voices telling us to be realistic were often the voices we most needed to ignore. But Marcus's impact reached even further than our immediate family. His story had spread through social media, shared by teachers, parents, and students who found hope in his journey. Comments poured in from around the country, from families dealing with similar challenges, from educators rethinking their approaches, from young people who had been told they weren't smart enough or focused enough or conventional enough to achieve their dreams. One message particularly stood out, from a mother in Oregon whose son had been diagnosed with ADHD and was struggling in school. She wrote, "I showed my son Marcus's story tonight, and for the first time in months, he talked about wanting to go to college. He's been so discouraged by all the people telling him what he can't do that he had stopped believing in what he could do. Thank you for showing us that different can be extraordinary." Marcus read every message, responded to as many as he could, and continued to use his platform to advocate for students with learning differences. He spoke at conferences, wrote articles for educational websites, and maintained his mentoring program, even while managing his demanding course load at MIT. His freshman year was everything we had hoped it would be and more. His professors appreciated his unique perspective, his creativity in problem-solving, his ability to think outside conventional frameworks. The same qualities that had made him seem like a problem student in traditional classrooms made him a standout in an environment that valued innovation and original thinking. He joined research projects that aligned with his interests in sustainable engineering, contributed to papers that were published in academic journals, and formed friendships with students from around the world who shared his passion for using technology to solve global problems. He wasn't just succeeding at MIT, he was thriving there, finding his tribe among other brilliant minds who appreciated rather than merely tolerated his differences. But perhaps most importantly, he never forgot where he came from or the students still struggling with the same challenges he had faced. Every semester break, he returned home not just to visit family but to continue his mentoring work, to speak at local schools, to be living proof that the kids who don't fit the mold might be exactly the ones the world needs most. The boy they said would never amount to anything was becoming a force for change, not just in his chosen field, but in how society viewed and supported students who learned differently. His acceptance letters had been just the beginning, the opening, door to a life spent proving that potential comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements come from the most unexpected places. 2 years into Marcus's MIT journey, something extraordinary happened that none of us could have predicted. I was working my usual night shift at the hospital when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus that made me stop dead in my tracks in the middle of the cardiac unit. "Mom, you need to sit down for this. I just got a call from the White House." The White House. My son, the boy Linda had once dismissed as someone who would never amount to anything, had caught the attention of the federal government. It turned out that his research on sustainable energy solutions for urban environments had been selected for a National Youth Innovation Showcase. He was being invited to present his work directly to policymakers, scientists, and industry leaders as part of an initiative to address climate change through technological innovation. But that wasn't even the most remarkable part. The project he had developed, a system for integrating renewable energy sources into existing urban infrastructure, had originated from an idea he'd had in 8th grade. The same creativity that teachers had once seen as distraction, the same unconventional thinking that counselors had worried would hold him back, had led him to develop solutions that experts twice his age hadn't considered. When I called him that night after my shift ended, his excitement was infectious but grounded in something deeper than personal achievement. The best part, he told me, is that they specifically mentioned wanting diverse perspectives on their advisory panel. They're actively seeking out voices that haven't been heard before, approaches that challenge conventional thinking. Everything that made me different in school is exactly what they're looking for now. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The very qualities that had made him seem like a poor fit for traditional education were precisely what made him invaluable in addressing complex global challenges. His ADHD-driven ability to see connections others missed, his tendency to question established methods, his refusal to accept "that's just how things are done" as a final answer. These traits were revolutionary assets in the right environment. The White House presentation took place on a crisp October morning, and I took personal leave from the hospital to accompany Marcus to Washington, D.C. Watching him walk into the Eisenhower Executive Office building, carrying a presentation folder, And wearing a confidence that had been hard-earned through years of perseverance, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because his journey was over, but because he had definitively proven that potential has no expiration date and dreams have no size limit. His presentation was scheduled for 20 minutes, but it ran nearly an hour as government officials, researchers, and policymakers peppered him with questions about implementation, scalability, and real-world applications. They weren't just being polite to a college student. They were genuinely intrigued by solutions that could address both environmental concerns and urban planning challenges in ways they hadn't considered. After the presentation, Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of the National Science Foundation Sustainability Initiative, approached Marcus with an offer that left both of us speechless. They wanted to fund his research through a special grant program, providing him with resources to continue developing his ideas while completing his undergraduate degree. More than that, they wanted him to join their Youth Advisory Council, helping to shape national science policy from a perspective that traditional academic and industry voices couldn't provide. "We've been looking for exactly this kind of innovative thinking," Dr. Chen explained, as we sat in a government cafeteria that felt surreal in its ordinariness after the morning's extraordinary events. "The challenges we're facing require solutions that come from outside conventional frameworks. Marcus represents exactly the kind of fresh perspective we need to drive meaningful change." That evening, as Marcus and I walked around the National Mall, reflecting on the day's events, he shared something that surprised me. Despite all his success, despite the recognition and opportunities that were opening up before him, what mattered most to him was the work he was doing back home with students who were facing the same challenges he had overcome. "All of this is incredible," he said, gesturing toward the illuminated monuments around us. "But the real impact isn't in these buildings or fancy presentations. It's in the kid who's sitting in a guidance counselor's office right now being told to lower their expectations. It's in helping people understand that different doesn't mean deficient." This perspective led Marcus to make a decision that initially worried me, but ultimately filled me with pride. He negotiated with MIT and the National Science Foundation to structure his remaining undergraduate years in a way that would allow him to spend significant time on educational advocacy. He wanted to develop a systematic approach to identifying and nurturing unconventional talent, to create pathways for students whose potential wasn't recognized by traditional measures. The program he designed, which he called Hidden Genius Initiative, partnered with school districts across the country to identify students with learning differences who showed signs of creative problem-solving abilities. Rather than focusing on their academic weaknesses, the program highlighted their unique strengths and connected them with mentors, resources, and opportunities that matched their learning styles. The pilot program launched in 5 school districts during Marcus's junior year, and the results were remarkable. Students who had been performing poorly in traditional classroom settings began excelling when given projects that allowed them to demonstrate their knowledge through hands-on work, creative presentations, and collaborative problem-solving. More importantly, their confidence soared as they began to see their differences as advantages rather than limitations. Maria Santos, a high school sophomore from Phoenix, had been labeled as having attention problems and was on track to drop out. When she was selected for the program, she struggled with traditional textbook learning but had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that amazed her mentors. Through the Hidden Genius Initiative, she was connected with an aerospace engineer who recognized her potential and helped her develop her interests into concrete career goals. Within a year, Maria had not only improved her grades, but had designed a water filtration system for rural communities that caught the attention of international development organizations. She went from being considered a problem student to being recruited by engineering programs at prestigious universities. Her transformation wasn't just academic, it was personal, as she learned to value her unique way of thinking, rather than seeing it as a limitation. Stories like Maria's multiplied across the program sites, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond individual students. Teachers began reconsidering how they evaluated and supported struggling learners. Parents started advocating more effectively for their children's needs. School administrators began implementing policies that recognized diverse forms of intelligence and achievement. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Marcus himself. Watching other students discover their potential, seeing their confidence grow as they realized they weren't broken or deficient, but simply different, reinforced his own understanding of the journey he had traveled. He began to see his early struggles not as obstacles he had overcome, but as essential experiences that had prepared him to help others facing similar challenges. During his senior year at MIT, Marcus was approached by several tech companies offering lucrative positions that would have set him up for immediate financial success. The offers were tempting, especially for someone who had grown up watching his mother work night shifts to make ends meet. But he turned them all down in favor of a different path, one that aligned more closely with his values and long-term vision. Instead, he accepted a fellowship position that would allow him to pursue graduate studies while continuing to develop the Hidden Genius Initiative. The fellowship provided enough financial support for both his education and his advocacy work, plus the institutional backing to expand the program nationally. It wasn't the highest-paying option, but it was the most meaningful one. His decision surprised some people, including a few family members who couldn't understand why he would turn down immediately lucrative opportunities. But I understood completely. Marcus had learned early that success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about using your talents and opportunities to create positive change for others. He had been lifted up by people who believed in his potential when others didn't, and now he wanted to be that believing voice for the next generation of underestimated students. The expansion of the Hidden Genius Initiative brought Marcus to the attention of educational researchers, policymakers, and philanthropists who were interested in supporting innovative approaches to learning differences. He was invited to speak at TED conferences, to contribute to educational journals, and to consult with school systems that wanted to implement more inclusive approaches to identifying and nurturing talent. Each speaking engagement, each research paper, each consultation was an opportunity to challenge the conventional wisdom that had once limited his own opportunities. He spoke passionately about the need to move beyond deficit-based models of learning differences toward strength-based approaches that recognized the unique contributions that neurologically diverse students could make to society. His message resonated particularly strongly with parents who were struggling to advocate for their own children in educational systems that didn't recognize their potential. After one conference presentation, a father approached Marcus with tears in his eyes, thanking him for giving him the language and confidence to fight for his daughter's needs. "I've been trying to explain to her teachers that she's not less intelligent, just different," the father said. "But I didn't know how to articulate it in a way that would change their approach. Your research gives me the evidence I need to advocate effectively for her." These interactions reminded Marcus daily of why his work mattered, of how many students were still struggling in systems that weren't designed to recognize their potential. Every success story from the Hidden Genius Initiative, every student who went from being written off to being celebrated, represented validation not just of the program, but of the fundamental principle that had driven Marcus's own journey, that potential comes in many forms, and society's role is to recognize and nurture it rather than dismiss it. As Marcus's graduate work progressed, he began developing what would become his doctoral dissertation, a comprehensive framework for identifying and supporting unconventional talent in educational settings. The research combined cognitive science, educational psychology, and real-world data from the Hidden Genius Initiative sites to create evidence-based strategies for recognizing potential that traditional assessment methods missed. The work caught the attention of Dr. Ellen Morrison, a renowned educational researcher at Harvard who had spent decades studying learning differences. She invited Marcus to present his findings at a major educational conference, where his research was met with enthusiasm from educators who had been searching for better ways to serve their most challenging students. "What Marcus has developed," Dr. Morrison told the audience during her introduction, represents a paradigm shift in how we think about academic potential. His work doesn't just help us identify hidden talent, it helps us understand that what we've been calling hidden was often just different, and difference can be a powerful form of genius. The presentation was a turning point, not just for Marcus's academic career, but for the broader conversation about learning differences in education. His research provided the scientific backing for what advocates had been arguing for years: that students with ADHD, dyslexia, and other learning differences often possessed unique cognitive strengths that could be leveraged for exceptional achievement in the right environments. Following the conference, Marcus was offered positions at several prestigious universities, opportunities to lead research initiatives and shape the next generation of educators. But he chose to accept a joint appointment that would allow him to continue his research while maintaining direct involvement with the Hidden Genius Initiative, ensuring that his work remained grounded in real-world application rather than purely theoretical exploration. The decision reflected the values that had guided him throughout his journey. The understanding that true success comes not from personal accolades, but from meaningful impact on others' lives. He had learned this lesson from watching his mother sacrifice for his opportunities, from remembering the teachers who had believed in him when others didn't, from seeing the transformation in students who discovered their own hidden potential. As I watched my son accept his graduate degree, surrounded by professors who had come to respect his unique perspective and research that was already changing how educators approached learning differences, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. From that night in Linda's kitchen when he was dismissed as someone who would never amount to anything, to this stage where he was being recognized as a leader in educational innovation. But the most meaningful moment came not during the official ceremony but afterward, when a group of current Hidden Genius Initiative students surprised Marcus at the graduation party. They had traveled from across the country to celebrate with the person who had helped them discover their own potential, who had shown them that their differences were sources of strength rather than reasons for limitation. Standing in that room, watching Marcus surrounded by students whose lives had been transformed by his advocacy, by professors who valued his research, by family members who had finally learned to see his true worth, I realized that the acceptance letters from MIT had been just the beginning of his story. They had opened doors, but what he chose to do with those opportunities had defined his real legacy. The boy they said would never amount to anything had become a force for systemic change, a voice for the voiceless, a bridge between potential and opportunity for countless students who might otherwise have been overlooked. His success wasn't measured just in degrees or recognition or career achievements, but in the lives he had touched, the minds he had opened, and the futures he had helped to rewrite. And as I listened to those students share stories of how Marcus's program had changed their trajectories, how his belief in their potential had given them permission to dream bigger than anyone had ever encouraged them to dream before, I knew that this was what true success looked like. Not just rising above the limitations others place on you, but lifting others up with you as you climb. 5 years after that Sunday dinner at Linda's house, I found myself standing in the exact same kitchen, but everything had changed. The chipped blue table was still there, the coffee stains still marked its surface, but the energy in the room was completely different. This time, we weren't gathered for a routine family meal. We were celebrating something extraordinary. Marcus had just been named one of Forbes's 30 under 30 in education, and PBS was filming a documentary about his Hidden Genius Initiative. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Linda, who kept glancing nervously at the camera crew as if she could somehow edit out the years of doubt she had expressed about her nephew's potential. My father sat straighter in his chair than I'd seen in years, repeatedly mentioning to anyone who would listen that Marcus was his grandson. My mother fussed over the film crew, making sure they had enough coffee and asking if the lighting was flattering enough for her brilliant grandson. But the most profound change wasn't in how my family behaved around Marcus. It was in how Marcus carried himself. The quiet confidence that came from knowing his worth wasn't determined by their approval or disapproval. He answered the interviewer's questions with the same grace he had shown when facing their doubts, speaking about his journey not with bitterness about the past, but with hope for the future. "The people who doubted me weren't evil," he said when the interviewer asked about overcoming family skepticism. "They were operating from a limited understanding of what intelligence looks like, what success means. The real victory isn't proving them wrong. It's expanding everyone's definition of what's possible." The documentary crew had spent the morning at Marcus's research lab at MIT, where he was now pursuing his PhD while simultaneously running the Hidden Genius Initiative, which had expanded to over 200 school districts across the country. They had filmed him working with his research team, a diverse group of graduate students and postdocs who were developing new assessment tools for identifying creative potential in struggling students. But what the cameras captured that morning was more than just academic achievement. They documented the moment when Marcus received a video call from Jakarta, where one of his former mentees, Maria Santos, was now implementing water purification systems in Indonesian villages. Maria had not only graduated summa cum laude from Caltech, but had founded her own nonprofit organization focused on bringing clean water technology to underserved communities worldwide. "None of this would have happened," Maria told the cameras, from her base camp in rural Java, "if Marcus hadn't helped me see that my brain worked differently, not defectively. He taught me that the same mind that couldn't sit still in traditional classrooms was perfect for solving problems that required creative, unconventional thinking." Maria's success story was just one of hundreds that had emerged from the Hidden Genius Initiative. The program's alumni were now studying at top universities, founding innovative companies, and pursuing careers in fields ranging from biomedical engineering to sustainable agriculture. But more importantly, they were carrying forward Marcus's message that neurodiversity isn't a limitation to overcome, but a strength to leverage. The PBS interviewer, a veteran journalist named David Chen, who had covered education issues for over 2 decades, seemed genuinely moved by the scope of what Marcus had accomplished. During a break in filming, he pulled me aside to share his perspective. "I've covered a lot of educational innovators over the years," he said. "But what makes Marcus different is that he's not just researching solutions from the outside. He lived the problem, understands it at a cellular level, and that authenticity comes through in everything he does. He's not trying to fix students who are broken. He's trying to fix systems that can't see their potential." That afternoon, the film crew accompanied us to Marcus's alma mater, Lincoln High School, where he was delivering the commencement address to the graduating class. The invitation had come from the same administration that had once questioned whether he belonged in advanced placement courses, the same counseling department that had suggested he consider more realistic options for his future. Standing behind the podium where he had once received his own diploma, Marcus looked out at an audience of students, parents, and faculty members who had gathered to hear from someone they now considered a local hero. But his speech wasn't about his personal achievements or the recognition he had received. Instead, he focused on the graduates who might be sitting in that audience feeling like he once had, overlooked, underestimated, uncertain about their place in the world. "Some of you are probably getting advice to be realistic about your futures," he began, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "People who care about you are probably suggesting that you consider safer paths, more conventional choices. They mean well, but I want you to understand something important. Realistic is often just another word for limited, and your potential is anything but limited." He spoke about the danger of allowing other people's inability to see your gifts, to become your own blindness to them. He talked about the difference between confidence and arrogance, between dreaming big and being naive. He shared stories of Hidden Genius Initiative alumni who had transformed their supposed weaknesses into world-changing strengths. But the most powerful moment came when he addressed the parents and educators in the audience directly. "If you have a child or student who doesn't fit the traditional mold," he said, "please remember that the mold might be the problem, not the child. The next breakthrough in cancer research, the solution to climate change, the innovation that transforms how we live and work, might come from the kid who can't sit still in class, who asks too many questions, who sees the world differently than everyone else. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but what struck me most was the expression on the faces in the audience. Students who had been slumping in their seats were sitting up straight, eyes bright with possibility. Parents who had been worried about their unconventional children were wiping away tears of hope. Teachers were leaning forward, as if seeing their struggling students in an entirely new light. After the ceremony, something remarkable happened. A line of people formed, not to get autographs or selfies with Marcus, but to share their own stories of overcoming limitations, of finding success despite being told they weren't smart enough, focused enough, or conventional enough to achieve their dreams. Each conversation was a reminder that Marcus's story wasn't unique in its struggle, only in its visibility. Among those waiting to speak with him was Mrs. Davidson, his 7th grade math teacher who had once suggested he might benefit from modified expectations. She approached him with obvious nervousness, unsure how he would receive her after years of doubt. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I thought I was being helpful by encouraging you to set smaller goals. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment, but I see now that I was limiting you based on my own narrow understanding of intelligence and potential." Marcus's response was immediate and gracious. "Mrs. Davidson, you don't owe me any apology. You were working with the tools and understanding you had at the time. What matters is that we both learned something from the experience. I learned to trust my own vision of what was possible, and maybe you learned to trust in possibilities you hadn't considered before." Their conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mrs. Davidson sharing how Marcus's success had led her to completely restructure her approach to teaching students with learning differences. She had attended workshops on neurodiversity, implemented new assessment methods, and was now one of the most effective advocates for unconventional learners in her school district. "Your story didn't just change your life," she told him. "It changed how I see every student who walks into my classroom. I look for hidden genius now instead of obvious deficits." This interaction embodied something I had observed repeatedly over the years since Marcus's acceptance letters arrived. His success had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond his personal achievements. Teachers were reconsidering their methods. Parents were advocating more effectively for their children, and students were refusing to accept limitations based on how they learned differently. The documentary filming wrapped up that evening with a family dinner at our house, the same modest home where Marcus had once struggled with homework while I worked night shifts to pay the bills. The contrast between that earlier time and this moment wasn't lost on any of us. The kitchen table where he had once cried over failed tests was now covered with research papers, grant proposals, and thank you letters from students whose lives had been transformed by his work. But what the cameras captured that night was more than just the transformation of our circumstances. They documented the evolution of our family relationships, the way success had healed old wounds and created new connections. Linda, who had once dismissed Marcus as a lost cause, now regularly volunteered with the Hidden Genius Initiative, using her background in business to help with organizational development and fundraising. My father, who had been largely absent from Marcus's academic journey, had become one of his most vocal supporters, attending conferences where Marcus spoke and sharing his grandson's achievements with anyone who would listen. My mother had thrown herself into supporting the families of current program participants, creating care packages and encouragement cards for students facing challenges similar to what Marcus had experienced. The transformation wasn't just about them recognizing Marcus's worth. It was about them expanding their understanding of what worth looked like, what intelligence meant, what potential could become when properly nurtured and supported. During the final interview segment, the PBS journalist asked Marcus about his long-term vision for the Hidden Genius Initiative and his broader goals for educational reform. His answer revealed the scope of his ambition and the depth of his commitment to systemic change. We're working toward a fundamental shift in how society identifies and develops human potential, he said. Right now, we're probably missing half the genius in our schools because we're only looking for one type of intelligence, one way of thinking, one definition of success. Imagine what we could accomplish if we learned to recognize and nurture all forms of brilliance. He outlined plans for expanding the program internationally, for developing new technologies that could identify creative potential in students regardless of their traditional academic performance, and for training a new generation of educators who understood that diversity of thought was a strength rather than a challenge to manage. But his most ambitious goal was also his most personal, ensuring that no child would ever again have to choose between being accepted and being authentic, between fitting in and standing out, between other people's limitations and their own limitless potential. Every kid deserves to have at least one person who sees their possibilities instead of their problems, he said. Every student should have someone in their life who believes they can achieve extraordinary things, even when the evidence isn't obvious yet. That's not just good for individual children, it's essential for our collective future. As the film crew packed up their equipment and said their goodbyes, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. From those early days when Marcus struggled to find his place in traditional classrooms, through the years of advocacy and perseverance, to this moment when his story was being shared with millions of viewers who might see their own potential reflected in his experience. The boy they said would never amount to anything had become a voice for every child who had ever been told to lower their expectations, every student who had been made to feel deficient because they learned differently, every dreamer who had been encouraged to be more realistic about their future. But perhaps the most important part of his story wasn't the success he had achieved, but the platform he had built to lift others up alongside him. Marcus hadn't just overcome the limitations others placed on him. He had dedicated his life to dismantling those limitations for future generations. The documentary, titled Hidden Genius: Redefining Intelligence in America, premiered 6 months later to widespread acclaim and sparked national conversations about educational equity, neurodiversity, and the untapped potential in our schools. It won several awards and was credited with influencing policy changes in dozens of school districts across the country. But for our family, the real victory wasn't in the accolades or recognition. It was in the knowledge that Marcus's story had become bigger than his personal triumph. It had become a beacon of hope for every parent advocating for a misunderstood child, every teacher looking for better ways to reach struggling students, every young person who needed proof that being different could be the source of their greatest strength. Standing in that same kitchen where his potential had once been dismissed, surrounded by evidence of the extraordinary impact he had made on the world, I realized that the acceptance letters from MIT had been just the beginning. They had opened the door to Marcus's future. But what he chose to build with those opportunities had created pathways for countless others to follow. The boy they said would never amount to anything had proven that sometimes the most powerful way to succeed is not just to rise above the expectations others set for you, but to spend your life ensuring that no one else has to face such limited expectations again. He had transformed not just his own story, but the very definition of what was possible for students who dared to think differently. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 7 years after Marcus had first opened those MIT acceptance letters that changed everything. I was getting ready for my shift at the hospital where I now worked as a nurse practitioner, having completed my own journey of pursuing dreams that others had considered unrealistic, when Marcus called with news that left me speechless. "Mom?" His voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard since his graduation from MIT. "You're going to want to sit down for this one. I just received notification that I'm being considered for the MacArthur Fellowship." The MacArthur Fellowship. The so-called Genius Grant that recognizes individuals who have shown exceptional creativity and potential for important future contributions. The same award given to groundbreaking scientists, revolutionary artists, and visionary social entrepreneurs. My son, the boy who had been told to consider trade school, was being evaluated for one of the most prestigious recognitions of intellectual achievement in the world. But even as I absorbed this incredible news, Marcus was already thinking beyond the personal honor. "If I receive this," he said, "it would provide 5 years of unrestricted funding that could completely transform what we're able to accomplish with the Hidden Genius Initiative. We could develop new technologies, expand internationally, and create research partnerships that we've only dreamed about." The MacArthur Foundation conducts its selection process in complete secrecy, with nominees unaware they're being considered until they receive the final notification. The fact that Marcus had been told he was under consideration meant he was already among the final candidates, a recognition that in itself validated everything he had worked to achieve. Over the following weeks, as we waited for the Foundation's decision, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. The same unconventional thinking that teachers had once seen as problematic, the same creative problem-solving that counselors had worried would limit his opportunities, had become the foundation for work that was now being recognized at the highest levels of academic and social achievement. The transformation in how the world saw Marcus was remarkable, but what struck me most was how consistent he had remained throughout his rise to prominence. Success hadn't changed his character or his mission. It had simply amplified his ability to create positive change. He still spent time mentoring individual students, still answered emails from parents seeking advice, still spoke at local schools where struggling learners needed to hear that their differences could become their greatest assets. 3 weeks later, Marcus was attending a research conference at Stanford when his phone rang with a call that would change his life forever. The MacArthur Foundation was on the line, informing him that he had been selected as one of the year's fellowship recipients. At 25, he was among the youngest people ever to receive the award. Recognition not just of what he had already accomplished, but of the transformative potential of his ongoing work. The official announcement came the following morning, and the response was overwhelming. News outlets from around the world covered the story of the young man with ADHD who had overcome educational barriers to become a MacArthur Fellow. But more importantly for Marcus, the recognition brought unprecedented attention to the issues he had dedicated his life to addressing. The phone calls started immediately. Venture capitalists wanted to invest in scaling his assessment technologies. Publishers offered book deals. Universities competed to recruit him for faculty positions. Television producers pitched documentary ideas. But what excited Marcus most were the calls from parents and educators who had heard his story and wanted to implement his approaches in their own communities. "This isn't about me," he told a reporter from the Washington Post who was writing a feature story about his selection. "This recognition is validation for every student who has ever been told they're not smart enough, not focused enough, not conventional enough to achieve extraordinary things. It's proof that the kids who don't fit the mold might be exactly the ones we need to solve the world's biggest challenges." The MacArthur Fellowship came with $625,000 in unrestricted funding over 5 years, but its real value was the platform it provided for advocating systemic change in education. Marcus used his newfound prominence to push for policy reforms at the federal level, testifying before congressional committees about the need for more inclusive approaches to identifying and nurturing talent. His testimony was particularly powerful because he spoke not just as a researcher, but as someone who had lived the consequences of educational systems that failed to recognize diverse forms of intelligence. He shared data from the Hidden Genius Initiative, showing that students who had been written off by traditional assessments were achieving breakthrough innovations when given appropriate support and opportunities. "We are facing global challenges that require unprecedented creativity and innovation," he told the House Education Committee during a hearing on educational equity. "Climate change, pandemics, poverty, technological disruption, these problems cannot be solved by conventional thinking alone. We need minds that work differently, that see connections others miss, that question assumptions others accept. Yet our educational systems are systematically excluding many of the students who possess exactly these capabilities. The committee members, many of whom had children or grandchildren struggling in traditional school settings, listened with unusual attention as Marcus outlined specific policy recommendations for supporting neurodivergent learners. His proposals weren't just theoretical. They were backed by years of data from programs that had transformed educational outcomes for thousands of students. Following his congressional testimony, Marcus was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where global leaders gathered to discuss solutions to humanity's most pressing challenges. Standing on the same stage where presidents and prime ministers had delivered addresses, Marcus presented a vision for educational transformation that could unlock human potential on a scale never before imagined. In this room, he told the assembled audience of world leaders, we talk about the need for innovation to address climate change, to create sustainable economic growth, to build more equitable societies. But we're overlooking our greatest renewable resource, the untapped genius in every school, in every community, in every country. We have children whose minds could hold the solutions we're desperately seeking, but we're failing to recognize their potential because they don't fit our narrow definitions of intelligence. His presentation included video testimonials from Hidden Genius Initiative alumni, who are now making breakthrough contributions in fields ranging from renewable energy to medical technology. Maria Santos appeared via satellite from Kenya, where she was implementing water purification systems that were saving thousands of lives. David Park spoke from his laboratory at Johns Hopkins, where his research on brain-computer interfaces was helping paralyzed patients regain mobility. Sarah Chen shared updates from her work developing sustainable agricultural techniques that were increasing crop yields while reducing environmental impact. Each of these young innovators had been identified by traditional educational metrics as struggling students with limited potential. Yet when given appropriate support and opportunities to leverage their unique cognitive strengths, they had become leaders in addressing global challenges. Their success stories weren't anomalies. They were examples of what became possible when society learned to recognize and nurture all forms of human intelligence. The response to Marcus's Davos presentation was immediate and concrete. 3 countries announced pilot programs based on his hidden genius model. Multiple foundations committed funding for international expansion of his assessment technologies. A consortium of universities established research partnerships to study and replicate his approaches to identifying creative potential in underperforming students. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Linda, my sister who had once dismissed Marcus as someone who would never amount to anything. She had watched the Davos presentation online and called me immediately afterward, her voice thick with emotion. Carmen, she said, I need to apologize. Not just to Marcus, but to you. I spent years doubting him, dismissing his potential, suggesting, you were being unrealistic about his future. I was wrong about everything. But more than that, I realize now that my limited vision could have damaged him permanently if you hadn't been strong enough to believe in him despite what everyone else was saying. Her apology was sincere and long overdue, but what struck me most was her next comment. I've been thinking about all the other kids I might have underestimated over the years, all the students whose potential I might have dismissed because they didn't fit my narrow definition of intelligence. Marcus's success has made me realize how much damage well-meaning adults can do when we project our own limitations onto children's possibilities. This recognition led Linda to volunteer with a local chapter of the Hidden Genius Initiative, where she used her business skills to help identify and support unconventional learners in our community. She had transformed from someone who perpetuated limiting beliefs about diverse intelligence into an advocate for expanding definitions of potential and possibility. The MacArthur Fellowship also brought unexpected personal revelations for Marcus. During the selection process, he had been contacted by Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, a neuroscientist who had been researching the connection between ADHD and creative innovation. Her work had helped inform the Foundation's recognition of Marcus's achievements, but their conversation revealed something that put his entire journey into new perspective. "What you've accomplished," Dr. Rodriguez told him during a research collaboration meeting, "isn't success despite having ADHD. It's success because of the unique cognitive advantages that come with your neurological differences. The same hyperconnectivity in your brain that made traditional classroom settings challenging also enables you to see patterns and possibilities that neurotypical thinkers often miss." This scientific validation of what Marcus had intuitively understood about his own mind became a central theme in his expanding advocacy work. He began speaking not just about accommodating learning differences, but about recognizing them as essential forms of human diversity that contributed unique value to society's collective problem-solving capacity. His message resonated particularly strongly with parents who had been struggling to help their children succeed in educational systems that weren't designed for diverse learners. At a conference for families affected by learning differences, Marcus shared a story that brought the entire audience to tears. "A mother approached me last month," he said, "and told me that her 8-year-old daughter had been coming home from school every day convinced she was stupid because she couldn't read as quickly as her classmates. But this same child had designed an elaborate system for organizing her family's recycling that was more efficient than anything the adults had created. She wasn't stupid. She was a systems thinker whose intelligence manifested in ways her school wasn't equipped to recognize or nurture." He went on to describe how the Hidden Genius Initiative had developed new assessment tools that could identify this type of systematic intelligence in young children, connecting them with mentors and opportunities that matched their cognitive strengths rather than focusing on their areas of challenge. "Every child deserves to discover their unique form of brilliance," he concluded. "Not everyone will win a MacArthur Fellowship, but everyone has the potential to make meaningful contributions when they're supported in ways that match how their minds naturally work." The impact of Marcus's recognition extended far beyond his individual success. Schools across the country began implementing programs based on his research, training teachers to identify and nurture diverse forms of intelligence. Technology companies developed new educational platforms that adapted to different learning styles. Policymakers crafted legislation that required more inclusive approaches to academic assessment and support. But the most profound impact was on the countless students who saw in Marcus's story proof that their own struggles weren't signs of limitation, but potential sources of strength. Letters poured in from young people around the world who had been inspired by his journey to pursue their own ambitious dreams despite being told they weren't smart enough, focused enough, or conventional enough to achieve them. One letter, from a 15-year-old girl named Aisha in Detroit, particularly moved Marcus. "I have dyslexia and ADHD," she wrote, "and until I heard your story, I thought that meant I would never be able to do anything important. But you've shown me that maybe my brain works the way it does for a reason. Maybe I'm supposed to think differently because the world needs different kinds of thinking." Aisha had used Marcus's story as inspiration to start a peer tutoring program at her school, pairing students with learning differences with mentors who could help them discover their unique strengths. Her initiative had already helped dozens of struggling students improve their academic performance and, more importantly, their confidence in their own abilities. Stories like Aisha's reinforced Marcus's understanding that recognition and awards, while meaningful, were ultimately just tools for amplifying a message that desperately needed to be heard. That human potential comes in infinite forms, and society's responsibility is to create systems that can recognize and nurture all of them. As I watched my son accept the MacArthur Fellowship at the formal ceremony in Chicago, surrounded by other recipients whose work was transforming fields from poetry to particle physics, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. From that Sunday dinner at Linda's kitchen table, where he had been dismissed as someone who would never amount to anything, to this stage where he was being celebrated as one of the most innovative thinkers of his generation. But the moment that will stay with me forever came not during the official ceremony but afterward, when a young boy approached Marcus during the reception. The child, who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, had traveled with his parents from Milwaukee just to meet the man whose story had given them hope for their son's future. "Are you really the person who has ADHD and won the Genius Award?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity and hope. Marcus knelt down to the boy's level, making eye contact in that gentle way he had perfected through years of working with struggling students. "I am," he said simply. "And you know what? Having ADHD doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your brain. It means your brain works in a special way that might help you solve problems other people can't." The boy's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire building. "My teacher says I'm too hyper to learn good," he said. "But my mom says maybe I just learn different." "Your mom is absolutely right," Marcus replied. "And you know what? Some of the most important discoveries in the world have been made by people who learned differently, who thought differently, who saw things others couldn't see. Maybe you'll be one of those people too." As I watched this interaction, I realized that this was Marcus's true legacy. Not the awards or recognition, not the research papers or speaking engagements, but moments like this, where a struggling child learned that being different didn't mean being less, that their challenges could become their greatest strengths, that the adults who doubted them simply couldn't see the full picture of what they might become. The boy they said would never amount to anything had become living proof that potential has no expiration date, that dreams have no size limit, and that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements come from the most unexpected places. He had transformed not just his own story, but the entire conversation about what it means to be intelligent, what it means to be successful, and what it means to contribute something meaningful to the world. And as we walked out of that ceremony, past the photos of previous MacArthur Fellows whose work had changed the course of human knowledge, I knew that Marcus's story was just beginning. The recognition was wonderful, but the real work lay ahead. Continuing to build a world where every child's unique form of genius could be discovered, nurtured, and celebrated. The boy they said would never amount to anything had proven them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Not through revenge or bitterness, but through dedication to ensuring that no other child would ever again have to choose between being accepted and being authentic, between fitting in and standing out, between other people's limitations and their own limitless potential. 10 years after Marcus first opened those MIT acceptance letters, I found myself standing in the United Nations headquarters in New York City, watching my son address the General Assembly on International Day for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. The boy who had once been told he wasn't smart enough for college was now speaking to world leaders about reimagining human potential on a global scale. The invitation had come from UNESCO, which had adopted Marcus's Hidden Genius framework as part of their Education 2030 agenda. What had started as a small mentoring program for misunderstood students had evolved into an international movement that was reshaping how societies identified and developed human talent. Countries across 6 continents were implementing variations of his model, and the results were extraordinary. "Distinguished delegates," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the vast assembly hall with the confidence of someone who had learned to transform doubt into determination. "We stand at a crossroads. In human history, our species faces challenges that require unprecedented innovation: climate change threatening our planet's survival, persistent global inequality, technological disruption reshaping entire economies, and health crises that know no borders. The solutions we desperately need will not come from conventional thinking alone." He paused, allowing his words to resonate through translation devices that carried his message to diplomats from 193 nations. "They will come from minds that work differently, from students currently labeled as learning disabled who might actually be systems thinkers capable of seeing patterns others miss, From children diagnosed with attention deficits who might possess the cognitive flexibility needed for breakthrough innovation. From young people told to lower their expectations, who refuse to accept that limitations imposed by others must become their own reality. The speech was being live-streamed to classrooms around the world, where students who had been struggling in traditional educational systems were watching someone who understood their experience speaking on the world's most prominent stage. The message was simple but revolutionary. Being different wasn't a deficit to overcome, but a strength to leverage. In the months leading up to this address, Marcus had been traveling extensively, documenting the global impact of programs based on his research. In Finland, educators were using his assessment tools to identify creative potential in refugee children whose trauma had masked their abilities. In Singapore, technology companies were recruiting graduates from hidden genius programs who brought fresh perspectives to artificial intelligence development. In Kenya, young innovators identified through adapted versions of his model were developing solar energy solutions that were transforming rural communities. But perhaps the most powerful validation of his work came from an unexpected source. A longitudinal study conducted by researchers at Oxford University that had tracked outcomes for students identified through traditional academic measures versus those identified through hidden genius assessments. The results were staggering. Students flagged by conventional metrics as high achievers showed predictable success rates in traditional academic and career paths. But students identified through Marcus's framework, many of whom had been struggling, in standard educational settings, demonstrated significantly higher rates of innovation, entrepreneurship, and breakthrough problem-solving across diverse fields. They were more likely to start companies that addressed social problems, more likely to develop novel solutions to technical challenges, and more likely to make discoveries that advanced human knowledge. What we discovered, explained Dr. Sarah Williams, the Oxford researcher who had led the study, was that conventional academic success metrics were optimized for identifying students who could excel within existing systems. But the hidden genius approach identified students who could transform those systems entirely. This research had profound implications for how societies invested in human capital development. Countries that embraced Marcus's approaches were beginning to see measurable economic and social benefits as their educational systems started producing more innovative thinkers, more creative problem solvers, and more adaptive leaders. The transformation was particularly dramatic in regions where traditional educational resources were limited but hidden potential was abundant. In rural Brazil, a program adapted from Marcus's model had identified young people whose understanding of local ecosystems led to breakthrough developments in sustainable agriculture. In Bangladesh, students whose struggles with conventional literacy had masked their mathematical genius were now contributing to flood prediction systems that were saving thousands of lives. Every community in the world has hidden geniuses, Marcus told the UN Assembly. Children whose unique ways of thinking could hold keys to challenges we haven't even learned to ask the right questions about yet. Our responsibility isn't just to educate these young people according to existing standards. It's to create educational environments that can recognize and nurture forms of intelligence we're only beginning to understand. The speech was interrupted several times by applause, but the moment that brought the entire assembly to its feet came when Marcus introduced Dr. Kenji Tanaka via video link from Tokyo. 22-year-old Kenji had been one of the first international students identified through the Hidden Genius Initiative when he was struggling in a traditional Japanese school system that had labeled him as learning disabled. 5 years ago, Kenji said from his laboratory at the University of Tokyo, I was convinced I was stupid because I couldn't memorize information the way my classmates could. But Marcus's program helped me understand that my brain was designed for pattern recognition, not rote learning. Today, I'm leading a research team that has developed early detection systems for earthquakes that could save millions of lives across the Pacific Rim. Kenji's earthquake prediction technology had already prevented catastrophic damage in 3 countries. providing warnings precise enough to allow targeted evacuations while avoiding the economic disruption of false alarms. His success wasn't just personal triumph. It was proof that hidden genius, when properly identified and nurtured, could literally save the world. The video link switched to Dr. Amara Hassan in Cairo, who had been identified through a hidden genius program as a teenager struggling with traditional language arts, but showing exceptional spatial reasoning abilities. She was now revolutionizing archaeological research through advanced imaging techniques that were revealing previously unknown chambers in the pyramids and other ancient structures. "Every artifact we discover rewrites human history," Amara explained to the assembly. "And every discovery starts with seeing patterns that others have missed, asking questions that others haven't thought to ask. The same mind that couldn't write. Traditional essays in school turns out to be perfectly designed for reading the stories written in stone and sand across millennia." The presentation continued with testimonials from hidden genius alumni around the world. A young woman in Iceland whose struggles with traditional mathematics had led her to develop revolutionary approaches to geothermal energy. A man in South Africa whose childhood difficulties with standard reading had evolved into groundbreaking work in developing new forms of visual communication for multilingual communities. A teenager in Canada whose ADHD had been reframed as an asset in developing rapid response systems for natural disaster relief. Each story reinforced Marcus's central thesis, that human potential was far more diverse and abundant than traditional educational systems recognized, and that society's greatest challenges required the full spectrum of human intelligence to solve. Following his UN address, Marcus was approached by representatives from the World Bank, who were interested in funding large-scale implementation of hidden genius programs in developing countries. The bank's research had shown that nations with more diverse approaches to identifying and developing talent experienced faster economic growth, more innovation, and greater social stability. "What you've demonstrated," explained Dr. Patricia Chen, the World Bank's Director of Human Capital Development, "is that talent identification isn't just an educational issue. It's an economic development strategy. Countries that can recognize and nurture unconventional intelligence gain competitive advantages that compound over generations." The World Bank partnership led to the establishment of hidden genius centers in 50 countries over the following 2 years. Each center was adapted to local cultural contexts while maintaining the core principle of looking beyond traditional academic measures to identify creative potential. The results varied by region, but shared common themes. Students who had been written off began contributing innovative solutions to local challenges. Communities discovered resources they hadn't known they possessed, and entire educational systems began evolving toward more inclusive approaches to human development. But the impact extended beyond individual success stories or even national policy changes. Marcus's work had catalyzed a fundamental shift in how humanity understood intelligence itself. Neuroscience research inspired by his findings was revealing new insights into brain plasticity, creativity, and the relationship between learning differences and innovative thinking. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a neuroscientist at Stanford whose research had been influenced by Marcus's work, made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Her brain imaging studies of hidden genius program participants revealed that many students with learning differences possessed neural networks that were optimized for types of problem solving that were becoming increasingly valuable in a rapidly changing world. "We've been looking at learning differences as deficits for so long that we missed their advantages," Dr. Gonzalez explained during a TED Talk that went viral within days. Students with ADHD often have hyperconnected brains that can process multiple information streams simultaneously, exactly what's needed for managing complex dynamic systems. Students with dyslexia frequently show enhanced spatial reasoning and creative thinking abilities that are crucial for innovation. "We haven't been identifying learning disabilities. we've been identifying forms of cognitive specialization. This research began influencing everything from corporate hiring practices to medical school admissions. Companies started actively recruiting individuals with learning differences for roles that required creative problem-solving and innovative thinking. Universities developed new pathways for applicants whose potential couldn't be measured through traditional standardized tests. The ripple effects reached into Marcus's personal life as well. His relationship with our extended family had completely transformed, but not in ways I had expected. Rather than simply accepting their belated recognition of his achievements, Marcus had used his success as an opportunity to model grace, forgiveness, and the power of looking beyond past limitations. Linda, who had once dismissed him as someone who would never amount to anything, had become one of his most dedicated advocates. She had used her business connections to establish a foundation that provided scholarships for students identified through hidden genius programs, ensuring that financial barriers wouldn't prevent talented young people from pursuing their dreams. "I can't change what I said or believed before," she told Marcus during a family gathering to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his MIT acceptance. "But I can spend the rest of my life making sure other kids don't face the kind of doubt I showed you. I can help create opportunities for students whose potential might be invisible to people like I used to be." My father had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. The man who had once suggested trade school as Marcus's most realistic option was now volunteering as a mentor in the local Hidden Genius program, sharing his decades of practical experience with young people who were learning to see their differences as strengths rather than limitations. "I thought I understood what intelligence looked like," he admitted to Marcus during one of their mentoring sessions that I was privileged to observe. "I thought success had to follow patterns I recognized, achievements I could measure in familiar ways. But you've taught me that wisdom sometimes means accepting that there are forms of brilliance I'm not equipped to evaluate, and my job isn't to judge potential, but to support it." The personal healing that had occurred within our family became a model for the broader social transformation that Marcus's work was facilitating. Communities around the world were learning to question their assumptions about ability and potential, to look beyond surface-level challenges to identify deeper strengths, to create support systems that nurtured diverse forms of human excellence. This cultural shift was perhaps most visible in the changed conversations happening in schools everywhere. Teachers who had once focused on remediating deficits were learning to identify and leverage cognitive strengths. Parents who had worried about their children's learning differences were discovering ways to help them become sources of unique capability. Students who had internalized negative messages about their potential were learning to see their differences as distinctive advantages. The transformation was captured beautifully in a letter Marcus received from Mrs. Davidson, his former 7th grade math teacher, who had once suggested he might need modified expectations. Now, in her final year before retirement, she wrote to thank him for changing not just her approach to teaching, but her understanding of what education could accomplish. 40 years ago, she wrote, "I entered teaching because I wanted to help children learn. But I realize now that for most of my career, I was trying to make all children learn in the same way, achieve the same benchmarks, demonstrate mastery through identical measures. You've taught me that real education means helping each child discover their unique form of brilliance and then creating pathways for that brilliance to flourish." She had spent her final years in education completely restructuring her classroom to accommodate different learning styles, developing assessment methods that could recognize diverse forms of intelligence, and advocating within her school district for more inclusive approaches to identifying and supporting student potential. "Every year," she continued, "I have students who remind me of you at that age, brilliant in ways that traditional measures can't capture, struggling in systems that weren't designed for how their minds work. But now I know how to see their potential, how to nurture their strengths, how to help them understand that being different is often the first sign that you're destined for something extraordinary." Her transformation represented millions of similar changes happening in classrooms, families, and communities around the world. Marcus's story had become a catalyst for rethinking fundamental assumptions about human potential, creating ripple effects that were transforming how societies identified, developed, and celebrated diverse forms of excellence. As I reflected on the decade that had passed since those first acceptance letters arrived, I realized that the most powerful aspect of Marcus's journey wasn't his individual success, but his commitment to ensuring that success would never again be limited to those who fit conventional molds. He had used his platform not just to vindicate his own potential, but to expand everyone's understanding of what potential could look like. The boy they said would never amount to anything had become a global force for recognizing that genius comes in infinite forms, that intelligence manifests in countless ways, and that humanity's greatest challenges require the full spectrum of human cognitive diversity to solve. He had proven that sometimes the most important thing you can do with your success is use it to redefine success itself, ensuring that future generations will inherit a world with room for every form of brilliance to shine. Standing in that UN Assembly Hall, watching world leaders commit to implementing educational approaches that would recognize and nurture hidden genius in every corner of the globe, I understood that Marcus's story had transcended personal triumph to become something much larger. Proof that when we expand our definition of what's possible, we don't just change individual lives, we change the trajectory of human civilization itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.